non-Hispanic whites have the lowest level of poverty at 8.7%, about 1 out of every 10. And then Asians have a 10% of the Asian population lives below the poverty line. So about 1 out of every 10 Asians live below the poverty line in the United States. If we look under that, we see that poverty is broken down by sex into male versus female. And which sex has the higher poverty rate? Yes. Female. So women are more likely to live in poverty in the United States at 13.6% versus men at 11%. Why might that be the case? Why? Think about the various reasons why we might expect that more women will live in poverty in the United States than men. Kat?
They often bear the responsibility of taking care of children.
Absolutely, good. So one primary factor is that women are more likely to have responsibility for taking care of their children. This means that they're likely to take time off from paid work if they're working, right? And especially when their children are small. And what does that mean? They are less likely to be constantly promoted in their jobs. They're less likely to save as much as men for retirement because they're taking time out of paid work to raise their children. That means they're contributing less to Social Security over time. So when they ultimately receive Social Security benefits, those benefits are likely to be lower than men, okay? What are other reasons why women are more likely to be in poverty than men? Yes? The wage gap, right? So there is this significant wage gap where women still make less than the average man in the United States, and it's hovered around 80%. Women make about 80% of what men make. What else? What are other kinds of factors that might lead women to have a higher poverty rate than men? Yes? Single motherhood, definitely. So single motherhood, especially if that female-headed household is not getting child support, right, for whatever reason. That is definitely a factor that influences that. Discrimination in the labor market, right? So women who are facing a variety of types of discrimination in terms of their job, that's another factor that leads to women being more likely to live in poverty than men. Okay. If we skip down to region of the country, what is the region with the highest level of poverty in the United States? Yeah, Joshua. The South at 13.6%. Okay, and then the other regions, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West, are all around the same amount. Have about the same level of poverty at about 11%. Okay, so 1 out of every 10 people in those other regions live below the poverty line. I'd like to go down now to the row where it talks about disability status. Okay, and I'd like to look at the breakdown between people with a disability and people with no disability. So what is the poverty rate for people with a disability in the United States? Yeah, Jonathan. 24.9%, about 1 out of every 4 people with a disability live below the poverty line in the United States. And that's a very, very high number, okay? We do have disability programs to assist the disabled in the United States, such as temporary disability. If you have a temporary problem where you can't work, you can collect temporary disability benefits. But long-term disability benefits are sometimes hard to get in the United States. You have to go through an entire application process, and it is quite difficult. Versus people without a disability, their poverty rate is 10.1%, okay? So 1 out of 10 people without a disability live below the poverty line. Lastly, look at educational attainment, okay? Look at educational attainment, okay? And we see people here who have either no high school diploma a high school diploma, no college, some college, no degree, or a bachelor's degree and higher, okay? What do these numbers tell us about the importance of education as a protective factor against poverty? Someone who hasn't spoken today, yes?
The more educated you are, the less likely you are to be living in poverty.
Exactly, right? So hopefully that's one of the reasons why we're all in college, right? We're trying to improve our income prospects, our employment prospects, and you can see that the poverty rate drops dramatically from somebody who doesn't have a diploma, which is 24.5%, about 1 out of every 4 people without a high school diploma lives in poverty, to 4.8% for people who have a bachelor's degree or higher, okay? So yeah, like I said, this is all, and if you were to get a graduate degree, that poverty rate would even go lower for you, okay? So education is definitely a protective, definitely a protective factor against poverty in the United States. So this, I hope, gives you some sense of the nature of the problem in the United States. It's a serious problem when you have a little over 1 out of every 10 Americans living in poverty, and some people are, and some groups are disproportionately affected, right? One more thing that I should have pointed out, if we look at residents, the rows related to residents, and this has to do with people living inside principal cities where there's a high concentration of a population. You can see that the poverty rate is 15.6%. So that's poverty inside the core of urban centers in the United States, okay? And that's the highest level of poverty versus living outside principal cities and outside metropolitan statistical areas, which is sort of a census term that defines the density of a population group. So people living in the core part of the cities have the highest degree of poverty in the United States. And that's important because of what we're gonna talk about next, okay? So that's sort of the state of national poverty. I'd like to talk to you now about the effects of a high concentration of poverty in the United States. Why is this important and why does it matter in terms of thinking about public policy? So again, continuing on number 1, but I'd like to talk about the effects of a high concentration of poverty. So what happens when we get many, many poor people living in a geographically small area? What happens? There are a bunch of negative effects that we need to think about, okay? The first negative effect is that we have a reduction in private sector activity. Okay, what does that mean? When we have large numbers of low-income people living in a certain area and low-income households living in the same area, that makes the community a lot less attractive for private companies to invest in, right? We have a bunch of poor people living together, private sector investors, private sector companies, private sector employers, and business site location decision makers are going to be less likely to invest money there and their resources. So when you have a large set of low-income and poor individuals and low-skilled households living in a small place, that's going to make the community less attractive to private sector investors, private sector employers, and business site location decision makers. Remember in the news, there was this big story recently about Amazon, right? And at first it was going to locate in New York, and then it decided to change its mind. There's a lot, it's very, very important on these business site location decision makers, because they get to decide which communities are gonna benefit from the businesses and that they establish and the employees that they'll ultimately hire. So ultimately, because the private sector is not going to be interested necessarily in investing and starting businesses in these areas where there is a high degree of, or a large number of poor people, you're gonna have what's called a mismatch, okay? There's going to be a spatial, what is called a spatial mismatch. It's kind of a social science term, between the neighborhood residents, the people who are living within a specific community, and employment centers. They're not gonna be located in the same place. The people who are living in these poor communities are going to be living in these poor communities on their own, and they're gonna be far away from employment centers. Okay, people who are likely to hire them. There's gonna be a spatial mismatch between the people who live there and private sector activity. They're not gonna be matched together. One of the things that might be a little bit counterintuitive for you is that when we have a high degree of poverty, a high concentration of poverty in a small geographical location, this actually raises prices for low-income households who are living in that neighborhood. Okay, so upon first thought, you might think that, oh yeah, in poor neighborhoods, you're likely to find cheaper things, right? People can't afford it. But actually what happens is, if the private sector isn't investing money in that particular neighborhood, there's less competition, right? There are fewer businesses, right? A great example might be grocery stores, right? You might not have any large grocery stores that can provide food items at relatively low cost, okay, in these communities.